Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 18th chapter. At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to stumble. Such things must come, but woe to the person through whom they come. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into the fire of hell. See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly, I tell you, he is happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the 2 of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church, and if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. And if at this time you have children who would like to join Heidi and our other kids here who are already with her this morning for a lesson downstairs, they're welcome to go now. They're welcome to stay as well. Happy to have everyone here who stays here, no matter the age. But also we have a special lesson for them downstairs that relates to what we're going to talk to upstairs. If they go, I can understand, because it's a pretty tough topic today. The topic is calling out sin. And the point I want you to remember is this: don't call out sin lightly. Do not call out sin lightly. All 4 biblical readings help us to understand exactly what that means this morning. So I'm going to do something a little unusual for me. I usually like to focus on one of the texts and then draw in parts of the others for support. I want to go through all of them. So if you noticed in your bulletin, it's been a few weeks now that I've provided extra space around one of the texts, and none of them are like that. Because I want you to open your bulletin this morning to the first lesson, and we're going to go through each one. We're going to pull a little bit out of each one to help us understand this point. Don't take calling out sin lightly, and we're praying for the Spirit to drive home 2 things into our hearts according to His Word. When it comes to not taking the calling out of sin lightly, the first point is, don't fail to do it. That would be taking it very lightly, right? God says to call out sin. If you don't do it, that's taking it far too lightly. The other is, don't do it with the wrong attitude. calling out sin with the wrong attitude is just as much of a problem. And that's where Matthew comes back in. So we'll get to Matthew in just a minute. But let's look at not calling out sin lightly, both from the perspective of not failing to do it and not doing it with the wrong attitude. First, Ezekiel 33, 7 and 9. Ezekiel shows you can't take anything lightly when God calls you to do it. If God calls you to do something, you become responsible if it gets left undone. In the case of calling out sin, if he calls on you to warn someone about sin, you're part of the plan to turn that person around. And so he says if you fail to do it, you become partially responsible. It's not a matter of whether you're responsible for if they listen or not if you do tell them. This is just not doing it. Not doing it. Ezekiel says, Son of man, I've made you a watchman for the people of Israel. That's important by itself, by the way. God made Ezekiel a prophet. The context you're in makes a huge difference. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward into Matthew. But he made Ezekiel a watchman for Israel. He said, I've got special messages I'm giving to you in particular. You getting that message to Israel, that's part of my plan. So, hear the word I speak and give them warning from me. When I say to the wicked, you wicked person, you will surely die, and you do not speak to dissuade them from their ways, that wicked person will die for their sin, and I will hold you accountable for their blood. But if you do warn the wicked person to turn away from their ways, and they do not do so, they will die for their sin, though you yourself will be saved. So we're not responsible for whether or not people listen. But if God makes us part of the plan to warn someone that they're on a bad path, then we become responsible for not sharing that warning. It's a pretty basic thing, right? I think we all get that. That's simply taking it too lightly by failing to do it. Then comes the wrong attitude part. Psalm 32 says, Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and in whose spirit is no deceit. So two things there. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, not absent, forgiven. The assumption of that statement is that you have sinned. The blessing comes in the Lord letting it go. And then he says, Blessed is the one in whose spirit is no deceit. That's a fancy way to say something that we say real often. Don't kid yourself. Blessed is the one who doesn't kid themselves. Spirit and mind and heart, they're all kind of the same thing in Hebrew. This is about not kidding yourself about your sin. That's a serious problem. If you can find your way clear to warning somebody else about sin but don't recognize your own, that's a serious problem. Yeah, it's a problem if God tells you to call out sin and you don't call it out. That's obvious. But also if you don't recognize who you are and where you are, what your station is. If you say you have no sin, well, at least I must be a little bit less sinful because God entrusted me to warn someone else. If that's the case, you're kidding yourself about who you are. And that's a problem for even taking care of the issue. Because David continues, When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me. When I was kidding myself about my sin, my strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Failure to acknowledge sin is a spirit killer. It makes you less up to the very difficult task that we are not to take too lightly of calling out sin. The first two lessons make both things very clear. You can't take it so lightly that you don't do it, obviously. But also, if you don't remember your sin, who you are, where you are, how you relate to the person that you're called out, to whom you are called to call out their sin. If you don't remember that, you are weakened. And you have taken that task too lightly. Now, if you flip the page to Romans 13, and quickly remind yourself of the content of Romans 13, you might first say to yourself, how does this even relate? This is about the authority of the government. But if it was just about the authority of the government, it could end at verse 7, and it doesn't. That's important. Within that first set of verses, God says down in verse 4, those in the government are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. And he says in verse 6, that's why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. So give everyone what you owe them. If they're working for you, you owe them a wage, right? So if you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. And correct me if I'm wrong here. All of these things, as far as I can tell from the way Paul wrote this, all of these things relate to the governing authorities. And that's how it relates to the difficult task of calling out sin. They're doing that in some way as well, right? God calls them to be the referees, legally speaking, to actually call the balls and the strikes, to say when there's a penalty and when there's not, and to carry it out. And that's hard. If you don't think that's hard, you've taken it too lightly, and this set of verses will make no sense. That's why the last bit is included. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. Those who govern for you may get in the habit of mocking them, disrespecting them, dishonoring them. And you may feel you have that right because you've caught them doing wrong things. And I'll grant you, if you do wrong things, that doesn't deserve honor. But they've been called to a hard task. And you can't ever let that honor slide. They've been called to a task that God specifically wants them to do. And that relates to what we're talking about all the way back to Ezekiel here. If we have been in any way tasked by God to call out sin, we recognize that's a hard thing to do. So recognize that in those who have been called to it as a full-time job. So you owe them that debt of honor, that debt of taxes. All of these commands, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, whatever other command there may be, they are summed up in this one command. This ties all of Romans 13 to our psalm for the day, to our first lesson for the day. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love, Paul says, does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Love helps. Love does not harm. Don't take that lightly. Don't take lightly the fact that God has put us in a position where we are to call sin out. But that when we do so, we are dealing in things that are far more difficult than we first give them credit for. Like we dismiss the work of the government so easily. Luther says in his explanation to the 8th commandment in the Large Catechism, "For honor and a good name are easily taken away, but not easily restored." Calling out sin means you're saying somebody did something wrong. And even Luther says, don't take that lightly. In fact, Luther compares this task to that of the government as well. Luther says, when you are in a position where you know God has called on you to point out sin, you should be so careful with that that the two images that come to your mind at that point should be that of an executioner and a doctor. If you read this in the Large Catechism, all the council should be nodding their heads. I made them. When you are in a position where you have to point out someone's sin, you're doing something that in and of itself you should not be doing. Like an executioner. But does the executioner sin when he does his job? If you understand Romans 13, you know the answer is no. The government can sin in executing the wrong person. But they don't hold the sword for nothing. They are agents of God's wrath, doing what God asked them to do. That's a tough thing. But that's how tough this call is. Pointing out someone's sin, you should be so careful with it, you should think, am I doing this right? Because I can right now execute someone's good name if I'm not careful. The other image he wants you to bring to mind is that of a doctor. So the doctor does things that just aren't right. Touching people in places they aren't supposed to touch them. Doing things with a knife they're not supposed to do. But they do it in keeping with their profession so they don't sin with the position that they're called to. But you should be that careful with someone's name. You should be that careful. When you think about the fact that God has given us the task of calling out sin. So how can we do this difficult task rightly without harming the sinner? Luther, in the Large Catechism, points to our gospel, which, by the way, is also true of all of our church constitutions. They do the same thing. They point to Matthew 18. That might recall something for you. Our Constitution as well points to Matthew 18, especially that last section. It says if somebody has sinned against you, this is on page 5, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Kind of the first point here. The reason our constitutions point to Matthew 18, the reason that Luther points to Matthew 18 is, keep it as quiet as you can. If you can think of talking about somebody doing right and wrong as being something you should be just as careful about as an executioner is about their job and a doctor is about their job, then you can understand why Jesus describes the situation like this. Do the job, but be so careful. If somebody doesn't know about somebody else's sin, who should you talk to about that sin? The person who sinned, right? It's just that simple. If you need the help of others, you go to a trusted couple of others. Keep the circle as close and as tight as you can. The idea of bringing something to the church, the idea of talking about each other in a congregation should be so far beyond a normal situation that it just doesn't occur. Because we should be just that careful. But tell me, brothers and sisters, how many people who will not step foot into a church do so because they expect that when they're there, people will use their tongues to be critical, to cut down, to not show love, but to lift themselves up, make themselves feel better by pointing out to somebody who's not doing as well. Do you think that counts for a large number of people who won't walk into a church? Then can I remind you of what the rest of Matthew says? I'll remind you of the tough part in just a second. I want to remind you of the easier part. No, it's not easier. It's not easier. It's not easy. In fact, it's so difficult that, like I said, we're going to have a whole dig-in about this. But the nicer part. The nicer part. You can take the task too lightly because you just don't do it. And you can take the task lightly if you do it with the wrong attitude. And what does Matthew say? What does this gospel record Jesus our Lord saying about our attitude in the kingdom? It should be like that of a child. It's in the same chapter. It's not coincidental. Like that of a child. You want to carry someone's reputation in your hand and still carry out the task God has called you to by pointing out sin when it's a danger to someone? Think like a child. Think that the person you're with is a child of God. That you are too. Don't think that by explaining Matthew 18 to us, Jesus is telling us how to be him. That's ridiculous. He'll get back to that in Matthew 23. We are brothers and sisters. None of us bigger or stronger than the others. None of us more valuable. None of us more moral. All children created in God's image. So don't tie that millstone around your neck just yet, because so many people have walked away from the church due to the way we have used our tongues. Sure, don't take the millstone thing lightly. I said I talked about that just a second. Don't take that lightly. When we, by the use of our tongue, drive others away from God and make them wonder, where is God really? Because it sure doesn't sound like he's there. We have driven somebody out of God's flock, and he doesn't take that lightly, nor should we. We've got to be so careful. Because, yeah, sure, we're not responsible for whether or not they listen. And they might just walk away and use our words as an excuse. But you really think that's the case every time? But before you tie that millstone around your neck, before you get there, remember how seriously God takes each and every one of those sheep. Not from the perspective of how horrible it is that we, with the use of our tongues, may have driven someone away, but for how important it is to remember that when we realize we ought to have a millstone. Remember that God, if he's calling you to the task of pointing out sin, he knows he's calling you to something difficult. And he knows you need guidance, and he knows you'll fail. And remember this, the way that we remember God best is when we can remember the tongue of Jesus crying out peace, forgiveness, mercy, welcome. We can't take the task lightly, because it's a task from God to point out sin. But we can't take our own position too lightly either, nor the danger of using our tongues incorrectly. Remember what James said about that? The tongue is a world of evil among the members of the body. It sets a whole forest on fire. It's just what Luther was saying. It's easy to destroy a reputation, so hard to build one. But you still need one another to point out sin, because every one of us is a sinner. And each of us has strengths in seeing certain sins versus others. Each of us has weaknesses in falling into certain sins versus others. So how will you do it? How will you do this? Well, not taking the task too lightly. Use your tongue like Christ's. Not as Christ. You got to remember your position, right? But like Christ, who though he was without sin, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Use your tongue with love. Remembering first and foremost that what you need to hear is God's own voice welcoming you home, so that you can sound the voice of welcome. Point out sin as one who knows what it is to fall. And who needs the person that you're calling out to just as much as they need you, because as you have weaknesses, they have weaknesses. And that's what this whole calling out thing is all about. Think of how you would treat somebody you love and respect if they were on a bad path. Think of how carefully you would want to speak to them about what's going wrong without ruining the relationship. Do that. It's not easy. You don't want to take it lightly. And you don't want to just not do it because that's far too light. But you also don't want to do it with the wrong attitude. Remember, he tells us this so that we can be a reflection of our Father, whose first use of the tongue is to express love and excitement just to have you at home. Amen. Please stand. My brother.